He came home to a broken door and an empty safe, and knew someone had been listening. The door hangs open, swinging slow in the wind. Inside, the safe stands wide and hollow, dust drifting through the late light. Ranger growls low, staring at the torn floorboards. Walter doesn't move. He already knows this wasn't random. Someone heard him speak. Someone came back for the truth. The ridge is silent now, but not empty. What would you do if the quiet place you chose started pushing back? Walter Hayes kept the receipt folded in his shirt pocket like it was something official. It wasn't. It was printed on thin county paper, the ink already fading where the sun had hit it through his windshield. $10. That was the winning bid. He had stood in the back of the county office 3 days earlier while a clerk with tired eyes explained that no one else had shown interest. The parcel was too remote. No utilities, no paved access. Former ranger station, she had said, as if that made it less of a ruin. He signed where she pointed, paid in cash. Now he was climbing Black Ridge in a pickup that rattled over every rock like it resented the trip. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, amber eyes fixed on the road ahead. The dog didn't pace, didn't whine, just watched, the way he always did when Walter drove somewhere new. The paved road ended 12 miles back. The dirt track narrowed, twisted, rose along a dry wash lined with scrub oak and brittle grass. Arizona stretched wide and hard around them. Sunburned hills, wind carving dust across open flats. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, old mining claims dotted the land like scars. Walter shifted into low gear and eased the truck over a shallow rut. The engine coughed. He patted the dash once like he was calming a nervous recruit. "You get us there," he muttered. "We'll call it even." He hadn't told anyone where he was going. There wasn't anyone left to tell. The warehouse job had ended the way most things had ended lately. A supervisor pulled him aside, said he was too intense, said customers didn't respond well to someone who scanned exits every time a door opened. Walter nodded, took the envelope, didn't argue. Arguing never changed outcomes. By late afternoon, the track leveled out. The trees thinned. The station came into view without ceremony. It wasn't dramatic. No sweeping reveal. Just a squat log structure sitting on a flat shelf of land above a narrow creek bed. The roof was metal, dulled by decades of sun. One shutter hung crooked. The porch sagged on the left side. Walter killed the engine. Silence dropped in hard. Not city silence. Not the hum of distant traffic. This was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears until you heard your own pulse. Ranger stepped out first. He moved in a slow circle, nose low, tail steady. Walter watched him work. If the dog didn't like it, they would turn around. The wind shifted through the pines behind the cabin. Dry needles whispered against each other. Somewhere far off, a raven called once and then went quiet. Walter walked the perimeter like he used to clear a compound. Slow, measured. He checked the back wall, the window frames, the space under the porch. No fresh tire tracks up here. No beer cans. No spray paint. Just dust and old wood and time. The front door stuck when he pushed it. He leaned his shoulder into it. The latch gave with a tired snap. Inside smelled like dry rot and old paper. One main room. A stone fireplace on the west wall. A cast iron stove in the corner. A table with one leg shorter than the others. A hallway that led to what looked like two smaller rooms in the back. Light pushed in through dirty windows and settled in pale bars across the floor. Walter set his duffel down. The sound echoed louder than it should have. "Temporary," he said aloud. Ranger didn't answer. He stood just inside the doorway, body angled toward the dark hallway. Walter noticed it then. The way the dog's shoulders tightened, the way his ears shifted slightly backward. Not fear, awareness. Walter listened. Nothing at first. Just the wind again. Then faint. A thin metallic tick, like something tapping lightly against tin. He turned his head toward the sound. It came from the back of the cabin. Ranger took one step forward, then another. He didn't bark. He didn't rush. He moved like he was approaching something that needed to be confirmed. Walter felt the old rhythm creep into his muscles. Scan, assess, identify cover, distance to exit. The hallway narrowed toward the rear room. One window at the far end. If someone was inside, they had one way out. He reached down without thinking and touched Ranger's collar. "Easy," he whispered. They moved together. The hallway boards creaked under Walter's boots. The air felt cooler back there, dust heavier. The metallic sound came again, slight, irregular. Walter stopped at the threshold of the last room. Shelves lined the walls, old binders, broken chairs. A rusted filing cabinet leaned against the far corner. The window in here was half cracked open, and a loose strip of metal flashing outside tapped against the frame in the wind. He exhaled once. Slow. Ranger walked in fully now, nose sweeping along the floor. He paused near the left wall, stared. Not at the window, not at the cabinet, at the floorboards. Walter followed his gaze. The boards there were darker than the rest, slightly warped, as if they had once been lifted and set back in place. Ranger lowered his head and let out a low sound in his throat. Not a growl, a warning hum. Walter crouched. The metal flashing ticked again behind him in the breeze, but Ranger wasn't looking at the window anymore. He was fixed on that patch of floor like it held something alive beneath it. Walter pressed his palm flat against the wood. Cool. Solid. But something about it felt wrong. He sat back on his heels and glanced toward the front door, half expecting to see someone standing there watching. Nothing. Just the empty stretch of land beyond the porch. Temporary, he repeated, softer this time. Ranger didn't move. As the sun dipped lower behind Black Ridge, the cabin darkened by degrees. Shadows stretched across the floor. The air shifted colder. Walter stood and walked back toward the main room. He would check the rest tomorrow. No need to start tearing into things on the first night. He carried his duffel to the corner near the fireplace, laid out his sleeping bag on the bare floor. Ranger settled near the door again, body angled outward. Night came fast in the high desert. The last light bled off the ridge. The wind picked up. The loose strip of metal tapped again, sharp, hollow. Walter lay on his back, eyes open, listening. Somewhere below the ridge, faint and distant, came the sound of an engine. He rolled onto his side. Ranger was already standing, not barking, just watching the darkness through the crack beneath the door. Walter's jaw tightened. He hadn't seen any tire tracks on the way up, and this road didn't lead anywhere. Walter lay still in the dark, listening to the engine hum fade somewhere below the ridge. It didn't climb toward the cabin. It didn't turn around either. It just idled for a long minute, then went quiet. Ranger stood rigid by the door. Walter didn't sleep much after that. Dawn came thin and pale through the dirty windows. The air inside the cabin felt colder than the desert outside. He rolled up his sleeping bag and stepped onto the porch with Ranger close at his knee. The valley looked empty. No dust trail, no movement, just scrub and rock and the dry line of the creek cutting through the land. Maybe it had been a ranch truck on some forgotten spur. Maybe nothing. Ranger didn't buy that. He trotted back inside and disappeared down the narrow hallway toward the rear room. Walter followed, slower this time. The boards creaked the same way they had the night before. The metallic tapping from the loose flashing was gone. The wind had died. Ranger stopped again at the same patch of floor. He didn't paw it right away. He lowered his nose and inhaled slowly, then looked up at Walter. "Yeah," Walter said quietly. "I see it." The wood was darker, slightly raised at one edge. Walter crouched and ran his fingers along the seam. The nails were older than the rest, flathead, different from the newer screws in other parts of the cabin. He went back to his duffel and pulled out a small pry bar and a folding knife, tools he always carried. Not because he expected trouble, because he expected the world to be unreliable. Ranger stepped back, giving him space, but didn't take his eyes off the spot. Walter wedged the pry bar into the seam and leaned his weight into it. The board resisted at first. Then it gave with a sharp crack that echoed through the cabin. He froze, listened. Nothing outside. No engine. No footsteps. He lifted the plank free. Underneath was not dirt. It was concrete. And set into that concrete, flush and solid, was the top of a steel safe. Ranger moved closer now, tail stiff. Walter brushed dust from the metal. The paint had peeled, but the surface was intact. Rectangular, heavy. The kind you bolted down so it couldn't be carried off. "Someone wanted this to stay put," he muttered. He ran his hand over the lock. It wasn't a dial. It was a simple key cylinder, older style. Walter sat back on his heels and looked around the room. Shelves sagged under old binders and mildewed folders. A filing cabinet leaned in the corner. A coat hook hung behind the door, empty. Except it wasn't empty. Behind the door, partly hidden in shadow, a small ring of keys hung from a nail. Walter stood slowly. 3 keys. 2 long skeleton keys, one shorter, steel, squared at the end. Ranger shifted his weight, eyes flicking toward the front of the cabin. Walter heard it too this time. Faint, distant. An engine turning over. Not climbing, not close. But there. He didn't rush. He took the keys and walked back to the safe, sat down cross-legged on the floor. Ranger positioned himself between Walter and the hallway leading toward the main room. Walter tried one of the skeleton keys first. It slid in halfway, then stopped. Wrong fit. Second skeleton key. Same result. He held up the small steel key and turned it between his fingers. It was worn smooth on one side, used often once. He inserted it into the lock. It slid in clean. For a second, he didn't turn it. He listened again. The engine below the ridge cut off. Silence rolled back in. Ranger let out a low growl, almost too soft to hear. Walter turned the key. A heavy click echoed inside the safe. He pulled the handle. The door opened with resistance, metal scraping against metal. Inside were no stacks of cash, no gold bars. Nothing dramatic, just paper. Folders bound with twine. Rolled maps secured with rubber bands turned brittle from age. A leather-bound notebook resting on top like it had been placed there last. Walter exhaled through his nose. He reached for the notebook first. The cover cracked when he opened it. Inside, neat handwriting filled the pages. Dates, weather notes, water levels in the creek, observations about runoff patterns after heavy rain. He flipped ahead. Different ink. Firmer strokes. References to a proposed mineral survey. Coordinates. Concerns about aquifer lines beneath Black Ridge. Ranger suddenly snapped his head toward the front of the cabin. Footsteps? No. Gravel shifting. Walter closed the notebook halfway and held still. The sound didn't come closer. After a long minute, it faded. Ranger's growl softened but didn't disappear. Walter set the notebook aside and unrolled one of the maps. Topographic, detailed, hand-marked in red pencil along the lower valley, circles around the creek, arrows pointing toward higher ground. He found a folded letter tucked inside one of the folders. The paper was yellowed but intact. He read the first line silently. To whoever takes responsibility for this station next. Responsibility, not ownership. Walter swallowed. This wasn't a forgotten stash. It wasn't some lucky break. It was work. He closed the safe halfway, but didn't lock it, left the key resting on top. The engine below didn't start again. Walter stood and walked to the front window. He wiped a clear streak through the dust with his sleeve and looked down the slope. Still nothing visible. Ranger came to stand beside him, pressed lightly against his leg. Walter rested his hand on the dog's head. I just wanted quiet, he said. Ranger didn't move. The cabin didn't feel temporary anymore. It felt like a line someone had drawn in the dirt years ago, and Walter had just stepped across it. He stood there a long moment, hand resting on Ranger's head, eyes fixed on the empty slope below the cabin. The air felt thinner now, not from altitude, from weight, responsibility. He went back to the rear room and sat down beside the open safe. Ranger settled at the doorway, body angled toward the front of the cabin, ears alert. Walter picked up the letter again. The handwriting was steady, careful, not rushed. The man signed it, Elias Morton, former district ranger, Black Ridge. The letter wasn't dramatic. No accusations, no threats, just concern. Morton wrote about water, about the creek that ran year-round even in dry summers, about test cores proposed by a private mineral company that claimed there was lithium in the lower valley. Morton had circled one phrase in pencil. If they drill here, they hit the aquifer. Walter unrolled another map. This one was more detailed. Red pencil marked the watershed lines. Blue ink showed survey stakes from decades ago. There were notes in the margins. Measurements. Elevations. Dates. The last entry in the notebook stopped mid-sentence. Meeting with county rep. Nothing after that. Walter frowned. Ranger shifted suddenly. A low sound vibrated in his chest. Walter heard it too. Gravel crunching. Not the wind this time. Boots. He moved fast but quiet, closing the safe halfway and sliding the plank back over it without nailing it down. He grabbed the notebook and stuffed it into his duffel. Instinct, not logic. He stepped into the main room. Through the dirty front window, he saw two figures moving along the lower edge of the clearing, not climbing toward the cabin, not yet. They wore work boots, ball caps. One of them carried a long metal rod, the kind used for ground sampling. Ranger's growl deepened. Walter crouched beside him. Easy, he whispered. The men stopped near the creek bed. One knelt and drove the rod into the soil. The other checked something on a clipboard. Walter's jaw tightened. Survey work. He backed away from the window. The old reflex came back sharp. Contact front. Observe. Don't expose. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have one. He had made that choice months ago. No more escalation. Instead, he watched. The men worked for 10 minutes, drove the rod down, pulled it up, bagged a small sample, spoke briefly, though Walter couldn't hear what they said. One of them glanced toward the cabin. Walter held still. The man shaded his eyes, looking up at the porch. Ranger didn't bark, didn't move, just stared. After a long second, the men turned and walked back down the slope toward a white pickup parked near a bend in the dirt track below. The engine started. The truck rolled out of sight. Walter waited another full minute before stepping onto the porch. He walked to the edge of the clearing and looked down. Fresh tire tracks cut across the dust near the creek. Deep. Recent. Ranger moved ahead of him, nose low, tracing the path the men had taken. Walter followed to where the rod had gone into the ground. The soil there was disturbed, damp underneath. He crouched and pressed his fingers into the earth. Cool. Water not far below. He stood slowly. Lithium, he said under his breath. He didn't know much about mining, but he knew enough to understand this wasn't about a few holes in the dirt. It was about scale. Roads, drills, noise, trucks coming and going every day. He looked back at the cabin. Temporary had felt safe. Now it felt naive. Ranger stopped and looked up at him. Walter saw it then. The dog wasn't just reacting to strangers. He was guarding something. The cabin. The land. Walter walked back inside and reopened the safe. He flipped through more pages in the notebook. Morton had documented everything. Water flow after storms, seasonal patterns, wildlife movement. There were notes about meetings, about resistance from corporate interests, about being told to focus on assigned duties. The last full page ended with a line underlined twice. If no one speaks, they will assume no one cares. Walter closed the notebook. He sat back against the wall and let the silence settle around him again. Not the quiet of hiding, the quiet of thinking. He had come up here to disappear. Instead, he had found someone else who had tried to hold the line and failed. Ranger walked over and pressed his weight into Walter's side. Walter rubbed behind the dog's ears. I didn't sign up for this, he said quietly. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint smell of dust and hot metal from somewhere down the ridge. Walter stood. He walked to the old lookout tower behind the cabin. The ladder creaked under his boots as he climbed. From the top, he could see the lower valley clearly. The bend in the dirt road. The thin silver line of the creek. The place where the men had been working. And beyond that, further down, a larger clearing he hadn't noticed before. Freshly graded. Square. This wasn't a random visit. It was the beginning of something. Walter rested his forearms on the rail and stared out over Black Ridge. He thought about the warehouse, about the supervisor's polite voice, about how easy it had been to pack his things and walk away. Ranger's bark floated up from below, short, sharp. Walter looked down. The dog was staring toward the road again. The white pickup had come back. Walter stayed where he was on the lookout platform, one hand gripping the weathered railing. From up there, he could see the truck roll slow along the dirt bend below, then stop near the creek again. Ranger barked once more, sharp and warning. Down, Walter called quietly. The dog went still, though he didn't take his eyes off the truck. Two men stepped out again. Same boots, same caps. One carried a metal case this time. The other walked the perimeter of the clearing like he was measuring it in his head. Walter felt the old pull in his chest. The urge to act first, to close distance, to control the ground, contact front. He forced himself to breathe. This wasn't a battlefield. It was county land tangled up in paperwork and money. Charging down there would solve nothing. He climbed down from the tower carefully. Each rung creaked under his weight. Ranger met him at the bottom, tense and ready. Walter crouched and gripped the dog's collar. "We're not doing this like that," he said. The men below began setting small orange flags into the soil along the creek bank. One every 10 yards, clean, deliberate, like they had already been told this land would be theirs. Walter stepped back inside the cabin and grabbed the notebook from Elias Morton. He flipped to the pages about survey stakes. Morton had marked earlier test sites decades ago. Different company, same valley. History repeating. Ranger's ears twitched again. The men were climbing now. Not toward the cabin directly, but up the slope, following a diagonal path that would eventually bring them within sight of the porch. Walter stepped out into the open. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He just stood there. The men saw him at the same time. They paused, looked at each other, then kept walking, slower now. When they were close enough to speak without yelling, the taller one tipped his cap back slightly. "Didn't know anyone was up here," he said. Walter nodded once. "I am." The shorter man glanced at Ranger. "Private property?" "County surplus," Walter replied. "I bought it." The tall one looked past him at the cabin. "Didn't see a truck. Parked around back?" That was true enough. The shorter man adjusted the metal case in his hand. "We're doing preliminary soil checks. Standard procedure. Nothing invasive." Walter's jaw tightened slightly at the word invasive. "On what authority?" he asked, calm. "Mineral assessment. Lease application pending. All legal." Pending. Not approved. Walter didn't argue. He simply held their gaze. The taller man shrugged. "We're not here for trouble." Ranger stepped forward half a pace. Not aggressive, just present. The shorter man noticed. "That dog friendly?" "He is," Walter said, "until he isn't." Silence stretched between them. Wind moved through the pines behind the cabin. The loose flashing tapped again somewhere along the roofline. Finally, the taller man nodded toward the valley. "We'll be out of your way." They turned and started back down the slope. Walter watched until they reached the truck. Watched until it rolled out of sight again. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. Ranger looked up at him. Walter scratched behind the dog's ear. "They're not just checking soil," he said softly. He walked down to the creek after the truck was gone. The orange flags fluttered in the dry wind like warnings. He pulled one from the ground. The soil beneath was damp and cool. He thought about Morton's line in the notebook. If they drill here, they hit the aquifer. Walter stared at the valley for a long moment. He could leave. He could pack the truck tonight and drive until the road turned to pavement again. Find another temporary place, another quiet corner. That had always been the pattern. Ranger nudged his hand. Walter looked down at him. The dog's eyes were steady, not afraid, not restless, just waiting. Walter walked back toward the cabin and stopped at the porch. He looked at the faded county document folded on the table inside. His name printed above the parcel number. Ownership wasn't the same as responsibility, but it was close enough. He stepped back inside and grabbed his keys. Ranger followed immediately. "Town," Walter said. If this was legal, he wanted to see the paper trail himself. If it wasn't, he wanted someone on record knowing he had questions. As he locked the cabin door behind him, he glanced once more at the valley. The sun had shifted west. Shadows stretched longer across Black Ridge. The orange flags still marked the creek like a quiet claim. Walter climbed into the truck. Ranger settled into the passenger seat, posture stiff. The engine turned over on the second try. As they rolled down the dirt track toward town, Walter didn't look back, but he felt it. This wasn't about hiding anymore. This was about choosing whether to stand. The town of Dry Mesa sat low and wide beneath a washed-out sky. One gas station, one diner, a hardware store with a faded Coca-Cola sign on the brick. The county building stood at the end of Main Street like it had given up trying to impress anyone. Walter parked along the curb. Ranger stayed in the truck at first, watching through the windshield. But when Walter stepped out, the dog pushed the door open with his shoulder and jumped down beside him. "Stay close," Walter said. Inside, the air smelled like paper and air conditioning. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A woman in her 30s sat behind a counter stacked with folders, dark hair pulled back, glasses sliding down her nose. She looked up, measured Walter in a second, then Ranger. "Animals aren't allowed past the lobby," she said gently. "He won't cause trouble," Walter replied. She studied the dog. Ranger stood still, tail low, eyes steady. "Keep him beside you." Walter nodded. "I'm looking for information on a mineral lease application tied to Black Ridge," he said. Her fingers paused over the keyboard. "Parcel number?" Walter handed over the folded receipt from his pocket. She typed. The keys clicked in the quiet office. "There is a preliminary assessment request," she said after a moment. "No approved drilling permit yet. Just survey access." "Access to what?" Walter asked. "Subsurface mineral rights," she answered. "It's not unusual." Walter's jaw tightened slightly. "There's a creek running through that valley." She nodded once. "There are environmental review steps. Nothing moves without review." He held her gaze. "Does anyone review old reports?" "Depends what you mean." He reached into his jacket and placed a photocopy of Morton's map on the counter. Not the original. He'd made that copy at a self-serve machine down the hall before coming here. The woman scanned it. "This isn't in our digital archive," she said. "It was in the ranger station safe," Walter replied. Her eyes flicked up. "The old station. I thought that was just storage now." "It's not." Silence hung between them. "What's your name?" she asked. "Walter Hayes." "I'm Lena Morales." She looked back at the map. "If this is legitimate, it should have been filed," she said quietly. "But if it wasn't, it doesn't exist in the system." Walter knew that answer. He'd lived it. Lena leaned back in her chair. "There's a public hearing scheduled next week regarding the lease. You can attend. You can speak." Walter almost laughed. "One guy from a cabin," he said, "against a company with lawyers." She didn't smile. Sometimes one guy is what starts the paperwork. Ranger shifted slightly, pressing against Walter's leg. Walter nodded once. "Thank you." They stepped back outside into the dry heat. The town felt smaller now. On the way back up the ridge, Walter stopped at the hardware store and bought a small first aid kit and a length of rope. He didn't explain why. The sun was lower when they reached the cabin again. Ranger jumped out first and trotted ahead like he always did. Halfway to the porch, the dog yelped. Sharp. Sudden. Walter's heart slammed against his ribs. "Ranger!" He ran forward. The dog had his front paw lifted, body twisted awkwardly near the edge of the creek path. A thin wire glinted in the fading light, stretched low between two shrubs. A snare. Old, rusted, but recently disturbed. Walter dropped to his knees. Ranger's breathing was fast but controlled. The wire had caught just above the paw pad. Not deep, but tight. "Easy," Walter whispered, hands steady even as his pulse raced. He cut the wire carefully with his pocket knife. The tension released. Ranger stumbled once, then steadied. Walter examined the leg. A shallow cut. No bone damage. No swelling yet. He cleaned it with bottled water. Wrapped it firm, but not too tight. The dog watched him the entire time. Trusted him completely. Walter sat back on his heels and stared at the broken snare. This wasn't for rabbits. It was set along a walking path. Recent footprints were pressed into the dust nearby. Someone didn't just want soil samples. They wanted deterrence. Walter stood slowly. The quiet around the cabin felt different now. Not empty. Watched. He carried the cut wire up to the porch and laid it on the table beside Morton's notebook. Ranger limped once, then planted his paw and stood tall again. "You should have stayed in the truck," Walter muttered. Ranger's tail moved once. Walter looked toward the lower valley. The orange flag still marked the creek like a warning line. He felt the anger rise this time. Not hot, not reckless, cold. They could survey, they could file applications, but setting traps along the path? That changed the tone. Walter went inside and locked the door. He moved to the back room and reopened the safe fully this time. He pulled out every map, every page Morton had written. He spread them across the table in the main room. If there was going to be a hearing, he would not walk in empty. Ranger lay near the doorway, head resting on his paws, eyes open. Walter glanced at him. "You didn't quit on me," he said quietly. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again. Somewhere far down the ridge, an engine turned over. This time, Walter didn't feel the urge to disappear. He felt something else. Resolve. It felt different from anger. Anger burned fast and left nothing useful behind. Resolve settled in the chest and stayed there. A week later, Walter stood outside the Dry Mesa Community Hall with Ranger at his side. The dog's bandage was gone. The cut had healed clean. He walked steady now, but Walter still watched his step. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the street. Dust hung in the late afternoon air. Through the open doors of the hall, Walter could hear folding chairs scraping against concrete. He hadn't shaved, hadn't tried to look official. He wore a clean work shirt and boots. The notebook and copies of Morton's maps were tucked under his arm. Inside, the room smelled like coffee and old varnish. A long table sat at the front where 3 county officials were already seated. Lena Morales sat at one end, with a laptop open in front of her. People turned when Walter walked in, not because of him, because of Ranger. The dog stayed tight against his leg, calm but alert. Walter chose a seat near the aisle. At the front of the room stood a man in a gray suit that didn't belong in Dry Mesa. He spoke smoothly about opportunity, about jobs, about responsible extraction. He used phrases like minimal impact and environmental safeguards. Walter listened. He didn't interrupt. When the man finished, the county chairperson invited public comment. There was a pause. A rancher stood first. He worried about water usage during drought season. A woman from town asked about truck traffic on the narrow roads. Then it was quiet again. Walter felt Ranger shift slightly beside him. He stood. His knees didn't shake, but his hands were tight around the papers. "My name is Walter Hayes," he said. His voice sounded steady, older than he felt. "I own the old ranger station on Black Ridge." A few heads turned. Walter walked forward and placed Morton's copied map on the table before the officials. "This was found in the station safe," he said. "It documents aquifer lines beneath the lower valley. If drilling hits here," he tapped the marked area, "you don't just disturb soil, you risk the only year-round water source in that basin." The man in the gray suit cleared his throat. "With respect, sir, any drilling would be preceded by independent environmental review." Walter nodded once. "I understand procedure," he said. "What I don't understand is why this documentation was never included in prior assessments." He glanced at Lena. She met his eyes but said nothing. Walter continued. "The ranger who kept these records believed the water mattered more than the minerals. I'm not here to fight anyone. I'm here to ask that you slow down. Review what was already written. Don't assume the land is empty just because it's quiet." There was no applause, no dramatic reaction, just silence. Ranger leaned lightly against Walter's leg. The gray-suited man stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes, our company operates within all legal frameworks. We have no interest in damaging local resources. Preliminary survey does not equal active extraction." Walter held his gaze. "I've seen what preliminary turns into," he said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even an accusation. It was experience. The chairperson cleared her throat. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. The board will take all public comments under advisement. Under advisement. Walter gathered his papers and returned to his seat. He didn't feel victorious. He felt exposed. After the meeting, a few townspeople nodded at him as they filed out. No one stopped him. No one argued. Outside, dusk had settled over Dry Mesa. Walter paused beside his truck. "You did fine," Lena said behind him. He turned. "I didn't win anything," he replied. "This isn't about winning," she said. "It's about record." She looked down at Ranger. "I heard about the snare." Walter's expression didn't change. "Word travels fast," she added. "Be careful up there." "I am." She hesitated. "There's pushback now. That's not nothing." Walter nodded once. He drove back toward Black Ridge under a sky streaked purple and red. Ranger rested his head on the center console, eyes half closed. Halfway up the dirt road, Walter noticed something different. The gate at the lower bend, an old ranch gate that had always hung crooked, was now wired shut. He slowed the truck. The wire was new, twisted tight. No official signage, no notice. Just obstruction. Walter stepped out. Ranger followed. He cut the wire with the same knife he'd used on the snare. The metal fell to the dirt. He drove through and didn't replace it. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun had dropped fully behind the ridge. He parked, killed the engine. The silence returned, but it didn't feel the same as before. He stepped onto the porch. The front door hung slightly ajar. Walter stopped moving. Ranger's body stiffened. The door had been locked when they left. Walter didn't rush. He moved slow, quiet, every sense alert. Inside, a chair lay tipped on its side. Papers were scattered across the floor. The plank in the back room had been pulled up completely. The safe door stood wide open. Empty. Walter stood in the doorway of the back room and let the words settle. The safe door hung open like a mouth that had already said everything it needed to say. The shelves had been pulled down, folders torn. The plank lay split on the floor beside the hole in the concrete. Ranger moved first. He slipped past Walter's leg and lowered his nose to the ground. Slow, focused, not frantic. Walter didn't touch anything yet. He scanned the room the way he used to scan a clearing. Corners, windows, sightlines. The break-in wasn't wild. It was targeted. They hadn't taken the stove, hadn't taken tools, hadn't even touched the duffel by the fireplace. They'd gone straight to the back room. Walter crouched beside the open safe. The originals were gone. Morton's notebook, the maps, every marked page. He exhaled once. "They were listening," he said quietly. Ranger's ears flicked, but he kept working the floor. He followed a faint track of dust toward the front door, then outside onto the porch. Walter followed. Boot prints in the dirt. 2 sets, one heavier than the other. The tread matched the kind he'd seen by the creek. Ranger paused at the edge of the clearing, nose lifting to the wind. Then he moved, not down the main track, not toward the truck. He veered right, cutting through brush toward the tree line. Walter hesitated only a second before going after him. Branches scraped against his arms. The ground sloped uneven beneath his boots. Ranger moved with confidence, tail level, tracking something fresh. Walter's breathing stayed controlled, not rushed, but tight. About 50 yards into the trees, Ranger stopped. He stood over something half hidden beneath a flat rock. Walter pushed the brush aside. It was a single map page, creased, mud on one corner. The red pencil marks still clear. They hadn't meant to leave it. Walter picked it up carefully. Not the whole file, but enough. Ranger looked up at him. "Good," Walter murmured. He glanced around the trees. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. He felt it again. That line he'd crossed days ago, the shift from retreat to engagement. He wasn't being warned now. He was being challenged. Walter and Ranger returned to the cabin as dusk thickened into night. Walter closed the door and slid a heavy beam across it. Not to stop a determined man, just to slow him down. He set the recovered map on the table. Then he walked to the truck and retrieved a small portable scanner he'd bought years ago for paperwork jobs. He hadn't used it in months. He plugged it into a battery pack and began scanning every copied page he still had. Each pass of the scanner light felt deliberate. Insurance. Ranger lay near the door but didn't sleep. Walter's hands moved steady. They wanted the originals. Fine. They wouldn't get silence. By midnight, the digital copies were saved to 2 separate drives. Walter leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. He wasn't angry now. He was clear. In the morning, he drove to Dry Mesa again. Not to the county building this time. To the small newspaper office tucked between the diner and the hardware store. A bell jingled when he opened the door. A man in his 60s looked up from behind a cluttered desk. "Help you?" the man asked. Walter placed the printed copies on the desk. "You run local stories?" he said. The editor glanced down at the pages. "Depends what kind." "Land use," Walter replied. "Water?" The man leaned back, scanning the red markings. "This from the hearing?" "From before the hearing," Walter said. The editor looked at him over the top of his glasses. "You understand printing this means people will call," he said. Walter nodded once. "I'm used to that." The man studied him another second. Then he reached for a pen. "Leave me a number." Walter hesitated. He didn't have a landline. Didn't want to give his cell. "Just print it," he said. "You'll find me if you need to." Back at Black Ridge, the cabin felt smaller but steadier. The next afternoon, a thin column on page 3 of the Dry Mesa Weekly mentioned historical aquifer concerns tied to the proposed lease area. It wasn't front-page news, but it existed. Walter read the article at the table. Ranger's tail thumped once. Outside, a truck engine approached again. Walter didn't rise in panic this time. He stepped onto the porch calmly. The white pickup rolled into view and stopped at the edge of the clearing. The taller man stepped out. He didn't carry a clipboard now. He carried nothing. "You went to the paper," he said. Walter didn't deny it. The man looked around the cabin, then back at Walter. "This doesn't have to get ugly." Walter held his gaze. "It doesn't," he agreed. A long silence stretched between them. Wind moved through the pines. Ranger stood at Walter's side. Not growling, not backing down. The man finally nodded once. "We'll see how this plays out." He turned and walked back to the truck. Walter watched until the dust settled again. He didn't feel victorious. He felt marked. Ranger pressed lightly against his leg. Walter looked down at him. "They're not backing off," he said quietly. The dog didn't move, and for the first time since buying the station, Walter understood something clearly. This wasn't about finding a quiet place anymore. It was about holding ground. The next week moved slower, not because anything stopped, because everything shifted sideways. The company didn't return with orange flags. No more trucks climbed the ridge. No men with metal rods walked the creek. Instead, letters started circulating in Dry Mesa. Printed flyers pinned to the corkboard inside the diner. Notices about economic opportunity, about responsible development, about outside interference. Walter saw one when he stopped for gas. Someone had underlined the phrase outside interference in red ink. He stood there reading it while Ranger waited beside the truck. The clerk inside the station watched him a second too long. When Walter walked in to pay, the man didn't smile. You stirring things up? The clerk asked casually. Walter set cash on the counter. I'm asking questions, he replied. The man shrugged. Jobs matter. So does water, Walter said. He left before the conversation could stretch further. Back on Black Ridge, the silence felt different again. Not watched. Waited. Ranger had been moving slower since the snare. Not limping. Just stiff in the mornings. Walter noticed it when the dog took longer to rise from the porch boards. He knelt one morning and pressed gently along Ranger's leg. The dog didn't flinch, but he leaned into Walter harder than usual. You're fine, Walter said softly. Just don't push it. He built a simple ramp up to the porch that afternoon so Ranger wouldn't have to jump. It wasn't pretty, just scrap wood and careful nails, but it held. Holding ground meant more than arguing at hearings. It meant staying steady. Walter drove into town again 2 days later. Not for a meeting, for work. The hardware store owner had mentioned needing help unloading a shipment. Temporary pay. Nothing permanent. Walter stepped into the store and waited near the counter. The owner, a broad man named Carl with sawdust permanently stuck to his shirt, looked up and hesitated. Hayes, Carl said. You still need hands? Walter asked. Carl scratched his jaw. I did, he replied slowly, but things got complicated. Walter didn't blink. Complicated how? Carl glanced toward the front windows, as if someone might be listening. Folks are saying you're trying to shut down a lease that could bring money into town. I can't afford to take sides. Walter felt the words settle heavy. I'm not asking you to, he said. Carl looked uncomfortable. I got a nephew who can handle it. Walter nodded once. Understood. He didn't argue. Didn't explain. He walked back to the truck. Ranger watched him from the passenger seat, head tilted slightly. Walter climbed in and shut the door. For a long moment, he didn't start the engine. He had expected resistance. He hadn't expected isolation. Driving back up the ridge, the land felt larger than ever. Empty. Beautiful. Unmoved by town politics. At the cabin, he unloaded a small sack of feed and a bundle of rope he'd bought, before knowing he wouldn't get the job. Ranger followed him inside. Walter stood in the main room and looked around. The chair that had been knocked over during the break-in was upright again. The safe was locked. The copies were stored in a sealed container beneath a loose floorboard he'd chosen deliberately. He wasn't naive anymore. He moved outside and began reinforcing the porch posts. Not because they were failing, because building steadied his hands. Hammer strikes echoed across the clearing. Ranger lay in the shade, watching. Late afternoon light stretched long over the ridge when a dusty sedan climbed the track. Not the white pickup. Different. Walter set the hammer down and stepped forward. Lena Morales stepped out of the driver's seat. She didn't smile. They're pausing the application, she said. Walter waited. Public pressure. Environmental review will take longer now. Pausing, Walter repeated. For now, she confirmed. Wind moved across the clearing. That doesn't mean it's over, she added. I didn't think it was, he said. She glanced at Ranger. He okay? He's fine. Lena looked toward the valley. Just be aware. When companies lose momentum, they look for leverage. Walter met her eyes. I've noticed. She hesitated, then got back in the sedan. As she drove away, Walter felt the shift again. They had slowed the lease, but he had lost the hardware job. He had lost easy anonymity, and he had gained attention he hadn't asked for. Ranger rose and walked to him. Walter rested his forehead briefly against the dog's. You could have had a quiet place, but he murmured. Ranger's tail brushed his leg once. Walter looked out over Black Ridge. The orange flags near the creek had been removed. The soil where they'd stood was already smoothing over in the wind. It looked peaceful again. But peace wasn't the same as safety. Holding ground meant staying when it cost something. Walter picked up the hammer again. He didn't know how long this would last. He only knew he wasn't leaving. The mornings on Black Ridge came quiet and wide. Light slid over the hills in slow bands, turning the dry grass pale gold. Walter started waking before sunrise, not from nerves, from habit. Ranger was usually already up, sitting near the porch, watching the valley like it was something worth guarding. Walter began climbing the lookout tower each morning, not because anyone had asked him to, because it gave him a full view of the lower basin. The dirt road, the bend by the creek, the graded clearing that still cut a clean square into the land. From up there, the world felt simple. You could see what moved. You could see what didn't. One morning, smoke rose from a small brush fire 2 ridges west. Thin at first, then thicker. Walter didn't hesitate. He climbed down fast, grabbed the old field radio mounted in the main room. It still powered on if you tapped the side hard enough. Static filled the cabin. He caught a fragment of a ranger channel. Patchy. Distant. Brush ignition. South quadrant. Walter keyed in and gave coordinates as best he could. The response came back faint, but clear enough. Copy that. We see it. He grabbed a shovel and a pack and headed west with Ranger pacing beside him. By the time he reached the smoke line, 2 county rangers were already there, cutting a small break. Walter joined them without being asked. No one talked much, just worked. Dirt, sweat, controlled breathing. Ranger stayed behind the line, eyes alert, never crossing into the heat. They knocked the fire down before noon. One of the rangers, a woman in her 40s with sunburned cheeks, wiped her forehead and looked at Walter. You the guy up at the old station? She asked. That's me. She nodded toward the ridge. We could use eyes up there. Budget's thin. Walter didn't answer right away. Then he said, I'm there anyway. After that, word shifted in town. Not loud, not dramatic, just small adjustments. The gas station clerk nodded once instead of looking away. The diner refilled his coffee without comment. Carl at the hardware store didn't offer him a job, but he handed him a box of nails without charging full price. Ranger moved easier now. The stiffness in his leg had faded. He took to walking the perimeter each afternoon like it was assigned duty. Walter fixed the broken shutter on the west window, replaced loose boards on the porch, cleared brush 10 yards back from the cabin to reduce fire risk. He wasn't fortifying. He was maintaining. The difference mattered. Late one evening, he sat at the table with Morton's last copied note in front of him. The line about silence. If no one speaks, they will assume no one cares. Walter read it again. He had spoken. The lease was paused. Not gone. Just paused. But something else had shifted. He climbed the lookout tower at dusk and sat in the old wooden chair. Ranger lay at the base of the ladder, head resting on his paws. The valley below looked still. No orange flags, no trucks. But Walter noticed something he hadn't before. The graded clearing wasn't random. It lined up almost exactly with the aquifer markings on Morton's map. They hadn't chosen the site by accident. Walter leaned back and closed his eyes for a second. For years, he had measured his worth by what he could endure. Deployments, noise, chaos. Then by what he could avoid. Crowds, questions, attachment. Now he was measuring it differently, by what he protected. Ranger barked once from below. Walter opened his eyes. 2 hikers were approaching along the ridge trail. Backpacks, wide hats, not surveyors. They reached the clearing and paused near the porch. Is this the old ranger station? One of them called. Walter climbed down. "It is," he said. They asked if they could refill water at the creek. He pointed them toward the shaded bend where the flow was cleanest. They thanked him. Before they left, one of them glanced at Ranger. "Good dog," the man said. Ranger stood taller. Walter watched the hikers disappear down the trail. The ridge wasn't empty. It just needed someone present. That night, Walter wrote a small sign and hung it near the road below. Black Ridge Station. Active. It wasn't official, but it was clear. A week later, a county ranger truck drove up unannounced. The woman from the fire line stepped out. "Mind if we log you as volunteer lookout?" she asked. Walter looked at Ranger. The dog's tail moved once. "I'm already watching," Walter replied. She smiled slightly. "Then let's make it official." Not a job. No paycheck. Just a radio frequency and a name on a list. But it meant something. That evening, Walter climbed the tower again. The valley lay wide and quiet. For the first time since he'd arrived, the silence didn't feel like something he was hiding inside. It felt like something he was responsible for. He rested his hands on the railing and looked out across Black Ridge. Below, Ranger lay stretched across the porch boards, guarding the door without being told. Walter read Morton's final page once more before turning in that night. There was a sentence he hadn't noticed before, written smaller near the bottom. "Some places aren't owned. They're kept." Walter closed the notebook slowly. He wasn't just staying. He was keeping. Not guarding out of fear. Not standing out of anger. Keeping. The weeks turned into months. The lease application didn't disappear. It moved through review. Slower now. Heavier. More questions attached to it than before. Environmental studies were ordered. Water testing scheduled. Reports requested from archives that hadn't been opened in years. Morton's name surfaced in old memos. Not as a rebel. Not as a troublemaker. As a ranger who had raised concerns. Walter learned that through Lena one afternoon when she drove up the ridge again, dust trailing behind her tires. "They found references to him in older files," she said, leaning against the hood of her sedan. "He didn't vanish. He resigned after the county dismissed his objections." Walter nodded. "So he left," he said. "He left," Lena confirmed. "Not because he lost, because he wasn't heard." The wind moved through the trees. Ranger lay at Walter's boots, calm but alert. Walter looked toward the valley. "I don't plan on leaving," he said. Lena studied him a second. Then she smiled, just slightly. "Good." After that, the trucks stopped coming altogether. The graded clearing remained, but grass began creeping back along the edges. The dust settled deeper into the ruts. The orange flags never returned. Walter didn't celebrate. He repaired the creek crossing instead, reinforced the shallow bank where erosion had started, planted native brush cuttings along the edge to hold the soil. Ranger followed him everywhere, stepping carefully along the water line, sniffing at dragonflies and listening to the small sounds of the ridge. One evening, late summer, the sky turned copper and violet all at once. Heat faded out of the air. The ridge breathed easier. Walter climbed the lookout tower slowly. Ranger stayed below this time, stretched out in the shade of the porch. From the top, the land looked endless. No flags, no trucks, no survey stakes, just the creek winding through the basin, the hills rising in quiet layers beyond it. Walter rested his hands on the railing. He thought about the warehouse, about the envelope slid across the desk, about how easy it had been to walk away. He thought about the snare wire biting into Ranger's leg, about the broken door, about the safe standing open and empty. He didn't feel anger when he remembered those things. He felt distance, like they belonged to someone else now. The radio on the wall of the tower crackled softly. A ranger unit reported a small lightning strike fire east of the ridge. Walter keyed in his coordinates. "Black Ridge lookout," he said. "I've got visual." His voice didn't shake. It carried. When he climbed down, Ranger stood and met him halfway. Walter crouched and pressed his forehead briefly to the dog's. "You picked the right fight," he murmured. Ranger's tail brushed the ground once. Later that week, a letter arrived in the small metal mailbox Lena had arranged near the base of the ridge. Official county letterhead, formal language. The mineral lease application for Black Ridge had been withdrawn pending indefinite review. No victory speech. No ceremony. Just a sentence in black ink. Walter read it twice, then folded it and placed it inside Morton's notebook. Not as proof of winning, as proof of staying. That night, he sat on the porch while Ranger kept watch at his side. The air had cooled. Crickets hummed low in the brush. The creek moved steady in the dark. Walter didn't feel like a man who had fought a battle. He felt like a man who had found a place. The town no longer looked at him as the outsider stirring trouble. They waved when he came down for supplies. Carl at the hardware store offered him work unloading once in a while. Not charity. Just work. The county ranger truck stopped by sometimes. Coffee shared on the porch. Fire reports exchanged. Weather watched together. Nothing dramatic. Just steady. Walter looked down at Ranger. "Guess we're not temporary anymore," he said. The dog lifted his head and blinked slowly. The old receipt for $10 still sat folded in Walter's drawer. He hadn't thrown it away. Not because of the price, because of what it marked. A crossing. He had come to Black Ridge to disappear. Instead, he had been seen. Seen by the land, by the town, by a dog who never once stepped back when things turned hard. Walter leaned back in the porch chair and listened to the wind move through the pines. Some people left when the ground got unstable. Some left because no one listened, and some stayed. Not because it was easy, because it was right. Ranger rested his head on Walter's boot. The ridge lay quiet beneath the stars. Walter Hayes had been fired. He had been pushed out. He had been told he didn't fit. But on Black Ridge, with the creek running clear and the tower standing watch, he fit exactly where he was. And he stayed. Not because it was easy, not because it paid well, not because anyone thanked him every day. He stayed because leaving would have meant pretending it didn't matter. Walter didn't win a fortune. He didn't become a hero. He didn't fix the whole system. What he did was simpler than that. He listened. He spoke when it counted. And he refused to walk away when something small and quiet needed someone to care. Ranger never asked questions, never weighed pros and cons. He just stood beside the man he trusted. Loyal, steady, present. Sometimes that's what holding the line looks like. Not loud, not dramatic, just consistent. This story isn't about land. It's about responsibility, about how wounded people can still protect something bigger than themselves, about how loyalty between a man and a dog can anchor someone long enough to heal. Some people leave when it gets complicated. Some stay. Which would you choose? 0 for leave, 1 for stay? If stories like this mean something to you, consider subscribing. There are more journeys ahead, different places, different battles, but the same question at the center. Who are you willing to stand for? And who stands for you?